Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. While Sandra finishes up talking, I want to welcome you and tell you what we are going to be thinking about today and why. So we're going to talk about zero-sum thinking, and it's a line of research that Sandra Sequeira, who's a professor at the London School of Economics, has been pursuing with a few other people and with a lot of success. It's very innovative and very interesting. The basic observation is that there is a mentality, there is a way of thinking that matters, that seems to make a difference to how people perceive the world. Think about yourself being a farmer somewhere in Mexico. This is a true story. This is how the initial observation of this came about. Farmer being in Mexico over the last couple hundred years and just mending your land, or maybe 400 years. Nothing much has changed. The faith in progress, civilization, advancement, whatever, is not going to be very strong. You're going to be thinking that the only thing that alters your life is if there's a bad guy that takes away stuff from you, or you take away from somebody else. So the world is zero-sum. The world is a fixed pie. And you are kind of trying to make do from one day to another without any expectation of growth. Capitalism, to some extent, is an optimistic credo. It's an optimistic credo that says, look, you don't need to fight over distribution, but you need to instead fight for improving things, and then everybody will be better off. Once growth stops, once we don't grow and we think like, okay, it's either me getting this or you getting that, we're back to that kind of farm which for 400 years, or 10,000 years to be fair, hasn't grown for hundreds of thousands of years. And we're back to that mentality where we are basically fighting for a fixed pie instead of kind of hopeful of the future. This type of mentality could be important to understand what's happening to the world, and there's nobody in the world better qualified to think about this than Sandra. She's a professor at the LSE, she's a PhD from Harvard, she's been doing a lot of research on development from Mozambique to, well, many other places, Brazil and Africa. She has a huge amount of grants, very good COVID, very good grants from multiple institutions, including the most prestigious grant that exists in the United Kingdom. She's a really promising researcher who you will hear very, very much, a very accomplished one already. You will hear very much over the next years, I am convinced of that. So I'm really delighted that she accepted our invitation to participate as a lecturer in our course. And she has said that she will be very happy to take questions as she speaks. So she's going to take questions as she speaks, and then we'll have probably a debate, dialogue later, depending on how much time we have and how many questions you have been asking. So enjoy the lecture, and please join me in welcoming Sandra. Thanks for coming.
Okay, so put this in the pocket, inside pocket if you want, or that one. Yeah, it works perfect. And come up here so that you're.
Perfect. Let's see. I was struggling with the clicker.
You managed.
I was struggling with the clicker.
Yeah. The clicker is not doing it.
Yeah, it's a bit finicky, so it's very slow. And then all of a sudden it works.
Also, you're going to have to be here, you think?
Right. I mean, I brought my own clicker. See, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Your own clicker is now in the USB plugged?
No, it's not. But this is not a pluggable clicker.
Your own? This one is plugged.
This one is plugged, but it doesn't really work.
And your own is not a pluggable
My
one?
own is this one. I just got it. No, it's not a pluggable one. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So it's really
That's annoying because you want to be able to walk
to
around.
be able to walk up and down, but I can make it happen. I'll just get my exercise, go up and down.
Okay, good luck.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Luis, for those kind words. I'll be probably running up and down to switch the slides, but hopefully, I'll get my exercise in time for dinner. But, so I think Luis already gave a fantastic introduction to why we think zero-sum is important. I think one of the key goals of this course is to try to textbook definition of zero-sum thinking, the belief that the gains of an individual or a group come at the expense of others. Now, this has been part of the lexicon of economists for many decades up until now, but it was first applied from a social science point of view to try to understand it as a mindset and how people might frame economic and social relations by an anthropologist, George Foster, back in the 1960s, and he used it to try to explain the worldview of pre-industrial societies. So these were societies that were facing scarce resources, limited growth. So in these settings, it is probably true that to get ahead, for some to get ahead, it has to be at the expense of others, so the world is genuinely zero-sum. And so he used this to explain these pre-industrial societies, but since then there's been more work, particularly in recent years, trying to show that this type of mindsets can apply beyond these types of settings. So even when the circumstances themselves are not necessarily zero-sum. So what I'll try to do today is to tell you about some of my work in this space. And the first question, so essentially I want to try to answer two questions. The first one is whether variation in zero-sum thinking, so people's proclivity to think in zero-sum terms or in positive terms, can explain differences in important policy views. Okay, so that's the first question. Does it matter? The second question is, if so, what drives variation in zero-sum thinking? And here I'm going to draw on examples from two types of context. So primarily I'll draw from examples in the United States. So this is work that I've done with some co-authors. But then I'll try to show the broader applicability of this concept and its relevance in a variety of settings. And so I'll try to go beyond the US and try to speak about its relevance in a completely different setting in the developing world. Okay, so let's dive into the US. So if you take just a cursory look at the media in the US, you'll see that these narratives of zero-sum, positive-sum are kind of jostling in the public discourse space. So you might see headings like these that will say extreme wealth does not cause extreme poverty, so openly not non-zero-sum. Or you might see something like remembering Steve Jobs, a visionary, or Bill Gates is saving the world. So this idea that there are individuals who are contributing to enlarging the pie. Okay? Or you might see the opposite narrative. And that narrative will be about every billionaire is a policy failure, or perhaps put more starkly that record profits are unpaid wages. So a very zero-sum way of framing essentially a similar issue of economic growth. Okay, so a bit more detail. How are we going to try to answer these questions? So whether variation in zero-sum thinking explains differences in views about policy. So we're going to focus on 4 key policies that we think that what is central to these policies is how people perceive the allocation of resources in the economy. So you either see resources as finite and therefore contested, okay? Or you see them as expandable and you think about, well, we're all about enlarging the pie. And so depending on whether you have one view or the other on how the world works and the nature of economic interactions, then that will determine whether you support, for instance, government redistribution or not. It will determine whether you support affirmative action when it comes to race or not. It will determine whether you support gender equality, and it might also have a role in how you think about immigrants and the allocation of resources between natives and immigrants. So we're going to focus on these 4 key policy domains. Then we're going to ask the second question of where does variation, if it exists, where does variation in zero-sum thinking come from? And here we're going to focus not just on people's own experiences and how they may shape the way you view the world, but also on the experiences of your ancestors. Okay? We're going to also focus not just on your direct experiences, but perhaps experiences indirectly from exposure in your communities. So for instance, you might be a migrant, so maybe that will shape your zero-sum thinking, or maybe you grew up in a region that had a lot of migrants. Okay? So that would be an indirect effect of the community on your worldviews. And in the case of the US, we're going to focus on what we think are 3 key factors that describe most of the economic and social history of the US in the last 150 years, which are economic mobility, immigration. So economic mobility is the American dream, so the land of opportunity in the US. It's a country built on immigrants, particularly European immigration in the last 150 years. And then lastly, unavoidable, we need to think about enslavement and the legacy of slavery, because this is, by definition, it's a zero-sum game, perhaps even negative-sum game. And so we're going to try to think about what are the implications of these factors in shaping people's zero-sum thinking. So how do we go about doing this? So we designed and implemented a survey that we ran online between 2020 and 2023. We had a sample of over 20,000 respondents, and we asked a bunch of questions on the demographics of the respondents, so trying to understand age, gender, political affiliation, voting records, and so on. Importantly, we introduced a module on ancestry. So we tried to understand what was the experience of your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents as well as they were growing up in terms of economic mobility, their experience with immigration, and so on. And then we have a module on policy views. And so here we're going to try to understand how much do people trust government. Are they in favor of redistribution or not? Are they in favor of affirmative action, gender equality, and what are people's attitudes towards immigrants? And then lastly, we ask questions to try to determine how zero-sum people are in their thinking. So how do we go about measuring zero-sum thinking? So here we're going to pick 4 domains that, again, we think lend themselves to zero-sum thinking, to thinking about whether resources are finite or how they can be shared across groups. And so the first domain is going to be to pit ethnic groups against each other. So we ask explicitly in the United States, there are many different types of ethnic groups. If one ethnic group becomes richer, this generally comes at the expense of other ethnic groups. Okay, so here we're trying to, in the domain of ethnicity, conflict across groups, for resources, we try to understand how much do you agree with this sentence and how that reflects your zero-sum thinking. Then we ask about a question on citizenship. So here pitting immigrants versus non-immigrants, okay, to the US. We have a third question on trade, international trade. So this is not just about individuals. It can also be across countries, right? So if 2 countries enter into a trade agreement, if one country makes more money, it must be that it's at the expense of another country. And then lastly, we ask about income groups. So in the United States, there are many different income classes. If one group becomes wealthier, it must come at the expense of another group. And then we ask people to rank their views from 1 strongly disagree up until 5 strongly agree. Okay? So let's see what people answer. So we have the 4 domains here: ethnic, citizenship, trade, and income. And the first striking fact is that there's a lot of variation, right? It's not that everyone is zero-sum or that no one is zero-sum. So across the board, we see significant variation, increasing 1 to 5 in zero-sum thinking across the different domains. Perhaps the one where we see a bit less action is in trade, and that could be simply that people are not thinking about trade as much these days. I mean, it's not as much a salient issue compared to immigration and ethnicity. Okay, so a couple more descriptives. Urban versus rural. So here we see a big difference between urban dwellers and people residing in rural areas. So urban dwellers tend to be much more zero-sum in their thinking. What do you think might be going on there? So just descriptive. So we don't have much of an explanation, but what do you think would explain why urban areas are a bit more zero-sum? Yes.
Inequalities are more visible.
Right, so inequality could be more visible. That's one.
More competition for places to live and jobs.
Right, housing markets, right? So we all know about competition for housing, and if you're all here in London, you're very well versed on this. Other resources, yes.
Well, it's similar. It's you know more people around and you're more empathetic, and maybe there are less advantageous situations and circumstances.
Exactly. So there's more competition in cities. We're competing for scarce resources, starting with land, with amenities, with everything. There could also be selection, that the people who come into cities are people who are also more zero-sum in their thinking. So we don't quite know why this is the case, but it's an interesting descriptive fact that in urban areas, people tend to be a bit more zero-sum in their thinking. What about income? So income here, we see a U-shaped relationship. I don't know what your priors would have been, but what do you think explains this? Like, why do we have poor people being more zero-sum and then at the same time the very rich? This is reassuring for us because we didn't want to just be picking up income. So it's just the income that determines whether you are at zero-sum or not. So it's an interesting relationship. Any views? So why would the poor be more zero-sum? In line with the...
They feel they're trying to get a share of the cake and they're seeing that everybody else has it and they don't.
Exactly. So it's very salient, it's very top of mind to them that everybody else has a slice of the cake and I don't, right? So the poor really view the world as zero-sum because that's their justification for being left behind, right? So everyone else is gaining at my expense. Okay? So that's for the poor. What about for the very rich? So then that kind of goes down as people are more financially secure, but then it goes up again. Okay, these are just hypotheses again. I'm not going to answer this question. Everyone's trying to steal the slice of the pie that I worked so hard to get, right? So I think this study, a lot of it is descriptive. It's just trying to capture these relationships, but it can open up many new lines of inquiry and research to try to understand some of these patterns. Okay? But the bottom line is that there is a lot of variation in zero-sum thinking, and so that's one thing that I wanted to be clear. Now, the second question is, once we've measured zero-sum thinking, we want to understand why does zero-sum thinking affect people's policy views? Okay? So Lisa already mentioned it. I started off saying that it's super important to try to understand people's preferences for different policies. But conceptually, what are the mechanisms? And so I'll just highlight a few. Again, I won't be able to disentangle across them, but I just want to give you a framework to think about the importance of zero-sum thinking. So the first one is an externality correction. So if we think that you're very zero-sum in your thinking and that the rich are rich because they did so at the expense of the poor, so we're taking away from the poor, then if you've done your microeconomics, then you know that this is a textbook case of market failure and it justifies government intervention. So the government should intervene to try to correct for this externality. The rich are exerting an externality on the poor, the government intervenes with more redistribution. The other concern that people may have is simply with procedural fairness. So it might be that you don't worry so much about the outcome, that you think, well, but if it is zero-sum, the rich are getting rich at the expense of the poor, and we don't like that. So we're going to vote for more redistribution just out of a concern for procedural fairness. The last possibility is that you operate just under self-interest. So depending on whether you are benefiting from the zero-sum interaction or you're at a loss and you're the disadvantaged one in that interaction, you're going to support redistribution one way or the other. So if you're rich or if you're poor, exactly as we were saying before. So let's see what the evidence tells us. So is zero-sum thinking influencing people's views on these four policy domains? So starting with pro-redistribution, the different colors are just different coefficients depending on different controls that we include in our regressions. But by and large, the coefficients go in the same direction. So if you are more zero-sum in your thinking, so as we increase on the x-axis here, zero-sum thinking, you tend to be more in favor of redistribution. If you're more zero-sum thinking, you're also more aware of racism and discrimination, and therefore you're more likely to support policies of affirmative action when it comes to race. If you're more zero-sum in your thinking, you're also more likely to support gender equality policies. Okay? And lastly, if you're more zero-sum, you're more likely to be against immigrants. Okay? So you're more likely to think that the gains of the immigrants come at the expense of the natives. So what this suggests is that there is indeed this correlation between zero-sum thinking and then people's policy preferences in these important domains. So you may, yes?
It's interesting that this is not
neither the income nor this type of result is very neatly falling out across ideological categories. Right?
Yes, that's a great question.
Are you going to think a bit about that?
Yes, we're going to spend some time trying to think what explains this variation, and the first culprit is partisanship. So is it just Democrats versus Republicans, and that's what's driving all this variation? So I'll spend some time. And that's not the case. It's not the case, exactly. Particularly when we see the immigration kind of doesn't seem to fit the narrative.
Sorry, we go to the previous slide. I think it's interesting that the last one, that immigration index,
Yes.
if that is asked within the same country, or for the, like, I think it depends a lot on the composition of the group we are asking, because if it is overrepresented by the minorities or the one affected, losing in this game,
Right.
rather against or in favor of policies that can like offset this effect.
Exactly. So no, that's a great question. So it's again your personal situation, your self-interest. How does that affect then or mediate the impact of zero-sum thinking on the particular policy preference? So I'll speak a little bit to that in a couple of slides, but that's a great question. Here, think of it as a sample that is fairly representative of the U.S., and so not everyone will be an immigrant. The reason why we don't do this analysis is saying, well, let's control for whether you are an immigrant or not in the profession, is mostly because conceptually we're not sure, is it the immigrant or is it a second generation immigrant or is it a third generation immigrant, and in what direction would we expect these things to go?
The demographic controls there don't control.
No, they control for gender, age, primarily. And we include income, we include education, and then we'll include some beliefs that I'll speak about in a second as well. Now, the reason why we have with and without control is that you may argue that these are bad controls. So they're kind of endogenous to your situation, and so that's why we have with and without controls. And so the bottom line or the main takeaway is that the effects are strong regardless of the controls that we are including. So on top of these questions, you may have other 4 questions that may come to mind. The first one that we often get is, are you just picking up other beliefs? So there's an extensive literature trying to understand what drives people's preferences for, namely, redistribution or affirmative action. And so maybe you're just picking up that. A second question is, well, this is fine. So this is people reporting their preferences for redistribution, but how do we know that this would actually correlate with real-world behavior? So you say you support affirmative action, but maybe in practice you do nothing to support this policy. And so this is another important question for this type of study that relies on a survey, essentially, to capture people's perceptions. The third one is, what can we say about mechanisms linking zero-sum to pro-redistribution and support for affirmative action, namely? So is it self-interest? So the question that came up, maybe it's self-interest. Is it this externality correction concern? What evidence can we muster to try to disentangle some of these links? And then lastly, of course, we're already talking Democrats and Republicans. Is this just the American exceptionalism at play? So to what extent would these types of dynamics play out in different settings, even beyond the US? So let me try to address these 4 in turn. So the first one is, how does this compare to other core beliefs? Now, there's an extensive literature that has looked at, for instance, the importance of how you think, whether luck is more important than effort in getting ahead in life. Okay? So how do you think that would describe redistribution, or how would that predict your attitudes towards redistribution? It's a common belief that we usually capture in surveys. You think that luck is more important than effort in getting ahead. Do you think that would lead you to be more or less?
I would say more pro-distribution if you think that luck is more important than that.
Exactly. So a very important confound is this type of belief, right? We don't want to be picking up that because that's what others have picked up and have shown that it's important. So we include a measure of this. We ask this question in our survey as well. Then there are a bunch of others: how you perceive mobility, your level of generalized trust, or maybe it's your trust in government, right? Because whether you support redistribution or not will depend on how much you trust the government to do that redistribution efficiently and effectively, right? Or maybe it's all about redistribution and sharing resources with your fellow man. So we capture all these different beliefs in our survey and then try to account for them to see, does our zero-sum index still survive? So does it still explain part of the observed variation in people's policy preferences, even when you account for all these other beliefs? And what this is showing us, so zero-sum index is always at the top. The top coefficient is going to show that by and large, it always survives the inclusion of the other beliefs. And in some cases, like for gender attitudes, is actually one of the main predictors across all these different types of beliefs. Okay, so this was the first question to try to see, are we picking up something new? And because we were introducing this new concept, it's important to make sure that we're not simply replicating results from related to other beliefs. So what about whether we're capturing real world behavior? So here we introduce what we call real stakes questions in our survey. So this is just one example of them, where we entered all the respondents into a lottery where they could make up to $1,000. And then we asked them, if you were to win the lottery, would you be willing to donate part of the lottery revenue to groups that advance racial equality in the US? And we gave specific examples of organizations that would do so. And so what we found is that about 51% of respondents chose to donate. The average amount was about 175. And then we tried to see, are they walking the talk? So the people who were more zero-sum in their thinking, the people who claim to support more affirmative action in race, are they also the ones who are more likely to donate? And that's exactly the correlation that we find. And we do that with other experiments and other real estate questions, but this is just to give you a sense of, we don't think that this is just cheap talk, because people were actually putting their own money on the line and to walk the talk, so to speak. Okay, so then there's a question of what is the mechanism here? So self-interest is obviously the first thing that comes to mind, particularly for economists. But when you look at the distribution of individuals across different income categories, so you can see them there, the 55 to 75, the emitted category would be lower than 55. And we look at our coefficients of the interaction between being zero-sum in your thinking and the different income categories. And so what is striking is that for all the different income categories, the effect of zero-sum is very similar. So it's not the case that this is driven by income. Okay? It suggests that for all income categories, if you're more zero-sum, you're more likely to favor redistribution. When you look here at gender, so this is the main effect. If you're a male, you're less likely to support gender equality policies. Okay? So on this side, you're less likely to support. This is just the mean effect. Okay? But if you're zero-sum, then you're more likely to support gender equality. Okay? If you are white, you're less likely, on average, to support affirmative action when it comes to race. But if you're more zero-sum, this is significantly, statistically different from zero, you are more likely to support policies of affirmative action when it comes to race. Okay? So while this is, it's not, we can't firmly establish that, oh, no one's operating according to self-interest. That's not true. But it is a smoking gun to show that self-interest is not the full story. Okay? So there must be some element of either an externality correction concern or some concerns with procedural fairness that you are willing, if you are more zero-sum, you're willing to go against your own self-interest if you're a male, and against your self-interest here if you're white, to support policies that don't necessarily benefit you. Okay? So this is the important takeaway, that it's not all self-interest. Okay. So the last question was about, is this just the US exceptionalism, or would we find similar patterns across the world? So the way to do this, we didn't manage to run many surveys across many countries worldwide, but we relied on an existing source of data, the World Value Survey, that is available for about over 190,000 respondents. We have it for about 72 countries. And in that survey, they ask a question that is not exactly how we measure zero-sum, but it has a flavor of zero-sum. So it asks respondents, gives them two opposing statements. People can only get rich at the expense of others, or wealth can grow so that there's enough for everyone. So positive sum against the zero-sum. And then people have a 10-point scale and need to to identify the point that best summarizes their view. So what do we find now? This is a sample beyond the US, so this is 72 countries worldwide. And when we correlate our zero-sum thinking index based on these two questions, or the response to these, where you stand against these two statements, and then here on the vertical axis we have a measure of political leaning, so left versus right. We find that by and large, if you're more zero-sum, you tend to be more left-leaning in your political and policy views. Now we tried to map our exercise to the data that we can find in the World Value Survey. And here we don't have exactly the same questions, but some of them are very similar. So we have questions about, do you think incomes should be more equal? Do you think the government should take more responsibility to provide for everyone? So these are two questions that are very much similar to our pro-redistribution index in our survey in the US. And then we have questions about immigrants. So the government should prohibit immigrants, and we don't want immigrants as neighbors. So this is trying to capture your attitudes towards immigrants. And we find something very similar to what we found in the US. So we find that if you are more zero-sum in your thinking, you tend to be more pro-redistribution. You want the government to intervene and equalize incomes, and you tend to be more anti-immigrant. Okay, so this is beyond the US. Okay, so then we're getting to this important question of, if we are fine with it, we've detected this variation in zero-sum thinking, okay, across the US, across other countries, then the natural next step is to try to understand, where does all this variation come from? And Louise was already anticipating that an important driver might be partisanship, right? So your views about government, about policies, tend to be very influenced by political narratives. The second potentially important driver is age. Because what do we find here when we look at age in zero-sum thinking? We see that there's a big divide, more so than across genders. So across genders we don't find a big divide, but across age we do. That younger individuals tend to be much more zero-sum than their older cohorts. Okay? So let's see what we can say about these two patterns. So starting with partisanship. So this is the distribution of the zero-sum index across, in blue, the Democrats, and in red, the Republicans. So we do find, perhaps in line with your priors, that the Democrats tend to be, on average, more zero-sum than the Republicans. However, what is striking about this graph is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap. And so what we think is that zero-sum is actually not explaining so much divides across parties, but it is potentially explaining variation within parties on people's policy preferences. Let me give you a couple of examples. So we don't usually think about the Republicans as being pro-redistribution, right? I don't know how familiar you are with the US context, but it's not something that would be most people's priors. Well, here we have the extent to which someone who reports as being a Republican, either a moderate Republican or a strong Republican. Okay? Again, in our scale, and then we have our scale of zero-sum thinking from 1 to 4. And so what this is showing is that if you're more zero-sum in your thinking, you're more likely to favor redistribution. So this is our standard outcome of pro-redistribution attitudes. And so it seems like zero-sum is actually explaining a lot of the variation within the Republican Party on who is most likely to support redistribution. So it tends to be those Republicans who view the world as being more zero-sum. Similarly, Republicans are not known for supporting universal health care. So it's a different type of redistribution. And we find exactly the same pattern. So we see that those Republicans who do support health care, universal health care in the US, are the ones who are most zero-sum, who understand that the game is very zero-sum, so the wealthy got ahead at the expense of the poor, and therefore we need these types of corrective policies to have more inclusive growth. Is this just about the Republicans? Perhaps not. If we look at the Democrats, so a big political puzzle was how could Democrats vote for Trump in 2016? Okay? Let's hope that that is not a puzzle in a month's time and that they don't vote for Trump. But but this is just based on 2016. We have people's voting record. And so we see that who voted amongst the Democrats, who voted the most for Trump? What is this graph suggesting? Four more zeros. Where do you think that came from?
They're very anti-inflation and
Right.
very zero-sum.
If you're exposed to Trump's rhetoric, what comes to mind immediately is that it's a very zero-sum rhetoric, right? It was very much based on the nativist argument of us against them. It was applied to immigrants. It was applied to trade with China. And so that type of rhetoric might have resonated more with Democrats who are also zero-sum. Okay? So again, these are just descriptives and it's just correlations. They're here to get us to think more carefully about these issues and do more research on them, but I think there's some stylized facts that are great starting points for us to better understand how zero-sum thinking and other beliefs can explain within party variation, which are sometimes puzzles that political scientists struggle to answer. What about age? So we saw that big divide between the young and the old. So in models of cultural evolution, there's this hypothesis that the young tend to have beliefs that are better matching the current environment compared to the old. So there might be some mismatch between older cohorts whose beliefs may not exactly match current circumstances. And so one hypothesis here is that perhaps the US was essentially less zero-sum in the past. So in the mid-1800s, we know that the US had exceptionally high rates of economic mobility. And since this time, work by Chetty and others have shown that that mobility has been declining. So the economic growth for the bottom 50% of the income distribution has been declining. And so could this help explain these differences across cohorts? Well, what we have here, so here we have the zero-sum index for the different cohorts in our survey. Okay? So we have respondents going back to the 1940s. Okay? And we have the evolution of zero-sum thinking, so across the different cohorts. And then here we're just depicting the economic growth at the bottom, the bottom 50% of the income distribution in the US. So we see that in the 1940s, growth was still high, so there was still significant economic mobility, but that declined with time. So what do you think is going on here? How would you read this graph?
The less mobility there is,
Yeah?
or any mobility by the growth of the bottom 50%,
Right.
and more people tend to think that the world is zero-sum.
Right. So it's possible that these two things actually go together. If you look at this graph, they're lining up quite neatly in the sense that we see that these cohorts experienced growth, therefore they're not zero-sum in their thinking, right? What they have top of mind is the pie enlarging with economic growth. And then you get to these cohorts here that most of what they've experienced, and this goes back to Louise's introduction, most of what they've experienced is economic stagnation. And so that perhaps is shaping their views and making them more zero-sum. Now, of course, here we can't really, just with this graph, distinguish what are cohort effects and what is just the effect of age. You know, maybe across the life cycle, you start with one view, and as you grow older, you have a different view. But this is where we turn to the World Value Survey again, beyond the US. And here, we actually have a lot of different cohorts for each country across time. And so we can do something a bit more precise. So what we do is for the 72 countries in the sample, we estimate the first, for each respondent, what were the first 20 years of GDP growth in their country as they were growing up. And then we try to see how does that correlate with zero-sum thinking? And we effectively find a pattern that is very similar to what we just saw in the US. So in this case with better data, where we see that if you grew up experiencing economic growth, then you're less likely to be zero-sum in your thinking. Whereas if you grew up experiencing economic stagnation, then you're much more likely to be zero-sum in your thinking. Okay? So this is already giving us some sense on how people's experiences may matter. So what I'll try to do next is to try to draw some on the key factors that I explained earlier that we think are important experiences for individuals in the US in the last 150 years, and try to see how much of these experiences can they explain this variation in zero-sum thinking. So starting with economic mobility, maybe this one I don't have to motivate too much given the most recent example. But if you're experiencing economic stagnation, you view the world as just competition for finite resources, and so you're more likely to be zero-sum in your thinking. If you've experienced personally economic mobility, you're more likely to think that the pie is constantly enlarging, and therefore there's less need for redistribution. So we try to measure economic mobility for the respondents, okay, today, but also for their parents, relative to their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. So we ask questions such as, right now, compared with other families in America, would you say your own household income is, and then we have a range from far below average to far above average. And then we ask similar questions about their parents. So when you were growing up, do you think your parents, compared with other families at the time in America, do you think their household income was below, above average? We ask for grandparents and all the way up to great-grandparents. And so by comparing these across time, we create a score for mobility. Now this is a perceived mobility score. Okay? We do other things looking at people's actual education and occupation across generations. But for now, I'll stick to the perceived mobility because we think that's exactly what's going to shape people's narratives and people's views of the world. And so what do we find? We find that when we look at parent to respondent mobility, grandparent to parent mobility, great-grandparent to grandparent mobility, so across all generations, and then we do the long difference between grandparents and respondent, we see that if you've experienced mobility across any of these generations, you're less zero-sum in your thinking today. Okay, so these coefficients are all below zero, they're all negative. What about immigration? So immigrants, and there's a vast literature on this of European immigrants in particular during the age of mass migration in the US between 1850 and 1920, that immigrants tended to experience an improvement in their quality of life. And generally, I have some other work that has documented how this has not come at the expense of natives and others. So that immigrants, particularly the European immigrants who went to the US during this period of 1850 to 1920, actually contributed to economic activity and enlarged the pie. So then we ask the question, did the experience of immigration, either you yourself or living in a county that had a lot of immigrants, could that have left this legacy of the zero-sum thinking or positive sum thinking? So here we have whether the respondent himself or herself was an immigrant to the US, whether their parents immigrated, or their grandparents. So first generation, second, third generation. And so what is clear here is that if you were an immigrant, you're less zero-sum in your thinking. Why do you think that's the case? So it works primarily for first and second generation. It gets diluted in the third generation. So what do you think is the link here between being an immigrant and being less zero-sum in your thinking? What do you think could explain this? Given the preface, yes.
Probably you are coming from a country that is not so well, so you experience that mobility, that kindness, wherever you get in the country you receive.
Exactly. So it's akin to the mobility argument, is that you arrive, you're contributing to society, you don't think that you're stealing from natives when you do so, right? So your experience of one is growth, of upward mobility. Similarly, the effect is still there if your parents were immigrants, less so it gets diluted, as I was saying, which is interesting with a third generation. What about the indirect effect? So I mentioned in the beginning that we would have this direct effect of being an immigrant, but there's also this possibility of indirectly, if you're growing up in a community where you see a lot of immigrants, the stories of rags to riches, they're doing great in the US, upward mobility, and so maybe that will have an impact on your views of economic interactions. And so what we do here is try to trace back to each respondent, their parents and their grandparents, whether they grew up in counties that had a high number historically of European immigrants. Okay? So if you're growing up in a county that received a lot of immigrants during the age of mass migration, does that then get transmitted to you via perhaps family narratives and others? And so it doesn't seem to matter if you're growing up today in a county that 150 years ago had more immigrants. Even for your parents, the effect is there, but it's less strong, but it's stronger for your grandparents. Okay, so if your grandparents were perhaps an age closer to the period of mass migration, between 1850 and 1920, then perhaps they experienced firsthand, very visibly, these rags to riches stories of immigrants, and therefore they are going to transmit that view of the world, of the America as the place where the pie is constantly enlarging and immigrants contribute to that enlargement, then that narrative still persists until today. Okay, so interestingly, this suggests that it's, again, not via the place you're living in, but it's via the cultural transmission that will occur across families. Okay, so very quickly, the last factor. So I mentioned slavery. Again, this is something unavoidable in the context of the US. The plantation slavery model was zero-sum by nature, by definition, potentially even negative sum form of production. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that even after abolition in the 1860s, that there were institutionalized, or there's forms of oppression that have persisted until today. And so it's something that we wanted to try to understand how much of this can explain variation in zero-sum thinking. So let's look across ethnic groups in our sample. So we have Asian Americans have the lowest levels of zero-sum thinking across all ethnic groups. Black African Americans have the highest. And then we have all the way down to white. Okay, so there's clearly a race effect here that seems to matter. Now, one question we ask is, could it be because people had enslaved ancestors? Okay? And so similar to the immigration story, it's something that gets transmitted, these narratives of oppression and this constant fight and competition for resources gets transmitted across generations. And so what we found here that is quite interesting is we have in red whether your ancestor was enslaved or not, and in blue they were enslaved. And then we have the distribution across the different categories. So when we look at African Americans, it actually doesn't really matter whether you in particular had an ancestor who was enslaved in chattel slavery in the US. Okay? But if we look at the other groups, we see a huge difference. It makes a huge difference if you experience this form of enslavement. Now, when we designed the survey, we were primarily thinking about chattel slavery in the South. And so we were expecting to look primarily at African Americans who would have had an enslaved ancestor. But we left the question open. And so what was interesting is that all the other groups reported different instances of enslavement. So we had Japanese internment camps, we had prisoners of war, we had here the Holocaust, or we had indentured labor from Ireland. So people viewed these kind of legacies from their ancestors as forms of enslavement, and that is shaping their views about zero-sum today. The fact that we don't see much of the marginal effect of having an enslaved ancestor for African Americans is probably due to the fact that here the thinking is more in terms of group oppression as to individual oppression, so the marginal effect of having an ancestor enslaved is probably relatively small relative to the generalized oppression to your group, which does not apply to the other ethnic groups. In interesting, we also found that if you're living in a county that historically, so by 1860, when slavery was abolished in the US, if your parents or your grandparents grew up in counties that had a higher share of slaves, then you're more zero-sum in your thinking today. And the effect is quite similar across the different generations. So this is quite different from the immigration story, right? So if you remember from a couple of slides back, I made the point that for the immigration story, what matters was that your grandparents were closer to the period of immigration. The fact that you are growing up in a county that had a lot of immigrants 150 years back doesn't really affect your zero-sum thinking. So what do you think these two contrasting results might suggest? Or let me know if you didn't understand the contrast. Essentially is that with slavery, location matters. With immigration, less so. It's more the personal exposure to immigrants.
I think that, let's say, negative views tend to stick more in the place, in the location, than the positive.
Well, particularly when it comes to slavery, right? So my opening statement was that with slavery, there's all this evidence of this institutionalized legacy of forms of different forms of oppression. There's discrimination, and many other factors that mean that there's a strong component here of the place is driving people's mindsets. Right? Whereas with immigration, less so. These are places that grew a lot. They had a lot of immigrants many years ago. And perhaps there's nothing today that is indicative of this legacy of immigration as it is in slavery. Okay? So the reason why I present these two is that I think this is super interesting to think about cultural transmission. And if that's what's happening here with zero-sum thinking, is that there are many different forms of cultural transmission. Some will be place-based, others will be family narratives that come from social interactions. Okay, I'll skip this and let's just take stock. So this was the first part of the talk, and then I have just a couple of points I wanted to make on the developing world. But let's go back to the questions that I started off with. So the first one is whether zero-sum thinking explains attitudes towards redistribution, affirmative action, and attitudes towards immigrants. And so we found good evidence that that is the case. And then we found evidence that both your own and your ancestral exposure to certain factors like economic mobility, immigration, or enslavement seem to shape the way people view the world and have a big impact on these mindsets. So now in just the tail end of the talk, I wanted to take you to a completely different setting. And again, the goal here is to just show this broader applicability of this concept of zero-sum thinking and how it can affect important policy decisions. And here, I wanted to take you to a case I think is quite relevant and quite important for understanding zero-sum thinking, which is people's attitudes towards refugees in the developing world. So you may be aware that there's been this surge in forced displacement in recent years. So we have over 130 million individuals have been forcibly displaced by mid-2024. So the problem with displacement is huge. And these refugees, when they move, they're there to stay. So they're in what we call protracted displacement. So they've been pushed out, they're not going to be resettled or go back home. And so the problem of integration into host communities is key. And they're operating in settings in the developing world where resources are incredibly scarce. So you have this double whammy of, on the one hand, people who are very different, there are a lot of ethnic differences, are trying to integrate, and resources are particularly scarce. And so the question that I'm going to ask here is whether economic experiences can shape zero-sum thinking and determine attitudes towards others. So this, in essence, again, what is central to this question is how do we allocate or redistribute resources across refugees versus hosts? And the experiences that I'm going to focus on is experience with financial security. Okay. So why do I think financial security might be important for how people think in zero-sum terms or not, and their attitudes towards refugees. Well, for one, that if you're financially secure, then that gives you a bit more bandwidth, more resources, fewer financial constraints for you to interact more with others, right? To interact in activities that can build social capital. It also reduces stress and mental burdens. Okay? So you're more open to others, you're more tolerant, more likely to be accepting, in this case, of refugees. And importantly, it shifts your attention away from competition. So very much like what we saw in the US, if you experience economic mobility or you're a successful immigrant, it kind of shifts your mindset or your attention from competition for finite resources into we're all here to enlarge the pie, right? So if you feel more financially secure, you're more likely to engage in more positive sum thinking. If you're exposed to negative shocks, it's the opposite, right? So if there's a negative shock to your financial security, then this is going to strengthen perhaps in-group cooperation. So in this case, hosts might, if they feel a negative shock, might not want to distribute resources with refugees, and so they only want resources to stay with hosts. It could also be that it just changes the salience of differences across groups. So now all of a sudden you feel a bit tighter when it comes to financial security. So you see all the different ways, the differences across groups and how different refugees are from hosts. And importantly, similar to the previous point, that bad experience can simply shift your worldviews. I think someone made that point earlier, is that now you're more focused, you're more risk averse, you're more focused in competition for scarce resources, you're more zero sum. So how am I going to test for this? So I'm going to exploit two shifters of financial security in these settings. So one is a positive shock, where both refugees and hosts are going to experience a boost in financial security. And then I'm going to see how does this change the host's attitudes towards refugees. So once we strengthen their financial security, are they more likely to be willing to share resources with refugees? And that will be done through a randomized controlled trial. And then I'm going to exploit a natural experiment, which is going to be in the same setting, a negative shock. So there was a hurricane that hit the study area 2 years after the graduation program was implemented. And so we're going to try to see what happens when the negative shock occurs. So once people feel threatened again when it comes to financial security, does that once more change their attitudes towards refugees? Do they become more zero-sum again in their thinking? So what is the setting here? So I worked in one of the largest, well, it is the main refugee camp in northern Mozambique. It hosts over 9,000 refugees. The way, just to give you a sense of the setting, is this is an image of the refugee camp. And this is an image of a host agglomeration that exists around the camp. So some of the hosts, kind of their dwellings were mushrooming around the refugee camp. Others predate the camp, and so they're kind of scattered, and over 16,000 individuals who are Mozambicans are scattered around the refugee camp. The refugee camp consists mostly of refugees from the DRC and Burundi and other countries in Africa. Now these two groups interact. So the refugee camp is very open, so it functions like a city. And it represents the closest market, the closest health facility, and the closest school for all the hosts. So the Mozambicans do use these facilities in the camp, and they interact with refugees all the time. So we have a sample of over 467 refugees and hosts. We're going to identify amongst the two groups which ones categorize as being ultra poor. So this is based just on a bunch of socioeconomic indicators, the quality of their housing, levels of income, and so on. And then we're going to assign them through the RCT. Both hosts and refugees are going to be assigned to being in a treatment group or in a control group, meaning that they're either receiving the graduation program or they're not receiving the graduation program. Okay, so then how do we measure financial security? So we have what are 4 key proxies of financial security. So one is your ability to pay a surprise bill. So in any given week, if you have a bill of $20, how easy would it be for you to repay this bill. So that's obviously a good proxy for financial security because that means that you have a network you can fall back on or you have savings that you can fall back on. Then we have to be a bit more concrete to also measure that specifically. What is the percentage income that you saved last month? What was the take-home monthly pay? And lastly, the household income in the last 6 months to account to potential volatility in income across these households. Okay? So we're going to use these 4 measures as an indication for the level of financial security of each of the hosts and the refugees who participated in our study. Then to think about social cohesion and social integration more broadly. So how can we ensure that refugees are integrating socially into these communities? We start with standard measures of social cohesion. So we ask people how much they trust others in their own group. So hosts, how much they trust other Mozambicans, refugees, how much they trust other refugees. But then we ask about cross-trust. So how much do hosts trust refugees? How much do refugees trust hosts? We ask an important question about willingness to share resources. So how willing are hosts to share jobs and financial resources and government support with refugees? And then not to just have attitudes, we wanted some behavioral measures as well. We ask about the share of your friends who are in the out group. So for hosts, how many of your friends are refugees? Then to go a bit deeper into integration, we have some metrics such as how satisfied are you with your job, how satisfied are you in general with your life, and whether the refugee feels that Mozambique is home. So this would be perhaps a more far-reaching, encompassing measure of integration. So even before we study our intervention, so the graduation program, we start by just looking at correlations and to try to see if you're more financially secure, does that mean that you're more trusting in general of others? Okay? And this is using our data, so our setting of hosts and refugees, and we find a strong positive correlation. You're more financially secure, you're more trusting of others. So this is just to allow us to benchmark our setting against the rest of the world once more. So again, I turn to the World Value Survey. Here we have a sample of about 59 countries that ask these questions. And we try to see if the respondent across these 59 countries is more financially secure and more financially satisfied with their position, does that mean that they're more trusting of foreigners in general? So this question in the World Value Survey is not specific about refugees, but it's about foreigners in general. And we find a very similar relationship to what we found in Mozambique. So it suggests that our setting is perhaps more representative of these broader interactions, that if people feel more financially satisfied, they're more likely to trust foreigners. Now, interestingly, when we do this, instead of looking at trust in foreigners, but we look at generalized trust, we see that the functional form is very similar, but the level effects are not as pronounced. So what do you think could explain that? I don't have an answer, so these are just conjectures. So if we do exactly the same exercise, how financially satisfied you are versus generalized trust. So not trust specifically about foreigners, but trust in general. And again, we see a similar pattern. It's just the level effects are not as strong. How would you try to explain this? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here. As I said, I don't have an answer to this. It's a stylized fact, so how would we think about that? Anyone want to venture a hypothesis?
Yes. So you're saying that the relationship stands, but it's weaker for the generalized trust.
It has the same
you are under financial distress, there is a narrative of distrusting the other because they are stealing your jobs or whatever. But it's not the other as any other person, but the other that is this like negative character that has his own like.
Yes. So the cleavages you see when you're in financial distress, you start looking for scapegoats, and you see who is most likely responsible for this, and you go for different groups, right? So that's the cleavage. Is the narrative that tends to exist in most societies is that if you want to blame someone, it's going to be the foreigners, right? So when it comes to trusting in foreigners, this plays a huge. Your financial security plays a huge role because when you think of foreigners, it's all about sharing resources with an outsider. And so, again, I don't have an answer, but I'm with you on this hypothesis that I think that's likely the explanation. And I think this is a good starting point, again, for us to understand populism and how people think about immigrants and others and how that relates to their own financial security. Okay, so I think this is evidence of that. So, okay, so that's something to go on. This is, again, it was before any intervention, so there's a ton of selection, but we just wanted to see, is there any correlation there between you feeling financially secure and you feeling more trusting of others and social cohesion? So then we actually try through an RCT to disentangle these effects causally. And so we randomize access to this graduation program. For those who are not familiar with it, it's a program that has been used in many countries in the developing world in the last 10 years and has proven to be a fairly successful policy to try to lift ultra-poor individuals out of poverty. And what it consists of is a large bundle of support, okay, everything at the same time. And this is the first time that the UN, I was working in cooperation with the UN on this, and it was the first time that it was tested in these types of settings with ultra-poor hosts and refugees. And so it included language training, you encourage people to participate in savings groups. There's a very important element of coaching, 18 months of one-on-one coaching to facilitate transition into forms of employment, either self-employment, you start your business, or wage employment. And then there's a very large income transfer. So this is an important point, is that this is a setting where we gave a very large income transfer, that it was equivalent to about 30 months of average income in these communities. So think of it as a big shock, a big shifter of financial security. And so the first thing that we test is, well, did it work? Did the graduation program actually shift randomly, so exogenously, right? Because we randomized this across treatment and control groups. For both hosts and refugees, did it improve their financial security? And for all our measures that I mentioned earlier, so the take-home pay, percentage of income saved, and so on, we see that the graduation program did what it was supposed to do. So both hosts and refugees were much better when they participated in this program. So then the question is, well, what happened to social cohesion? So all those different measures of trust, willingness to share resources, and so on. And the UN was very happy to see that without any particular intervention that was designed to foster social cohesion across refugees and hosts, that a byproduct of people feeling more financially secure was that everyone now was trusting of each other. Trust in group, trust across groups, they're more willing to share resources, they're more satisfied with their lives, so everything went up. Okay? So we moved the needle on all these different measures of social cohesion, just as a product of changing people's experience on financial security. So that was great. Everyone was very happy. The UN started scaling this up across many different countries worldwide after this first impact evaluation until disaster hit. Okay? So 2 years into our study, so in March 2022, there was a Category 3 hurricane that hit the study area. Okay? So that's the path of the cyclone. Here we have our participants. In blue, we have the hosts. In red, we have the refugee camp. And then what we observed is that there was a lot of variation at the individual level on who was most exposed to the hurricane and who wasn't. Okay? So we have here in blue, we have the dwellings who were part of our study that were damaged, and in red, we have the ones that weren't damaged. Why was this? Well, driven by a bunch of geographic characteristics. So there were certain households, if you go back to thinking about the pictures that I showed, certain households might have a tree that was 2 meters away. The hurricane hit, the tree fell on the house, you have to rebuild your roof, so you were damaged. So that affected your financial security, you need to draw down on your savings to rebuild. Another dwelling had a tree that was 6 meters away. That tree perhaps fell but did not damage your dwelling. And so what we take advantage of is looking very finely at geographic characteristics, how high up the elevation of your dwelling, flooding, and so on, to try to determine the probability that each participant in our study would have been affected by the hurricane. And then we measure actual destruction. So we ask people in our surveys, was your house destroyed because of the hurricane or not? So we have an actual measure self-reported by the participants. We get an NGO who is working with us to verify in situ what was the extent of the damage. And then we use satellite data from the UN as well, just to look at community level damage. And so this is the type of setting to bear in mind. And so then what happens? Well, let me try to encapsulate the story of this project in just a couple of graphs. So here we have financial security and how it responds to the two types of shocks that I mentioned. Positive income shock with the graduation program, and then a negative income shock with the hurricane. So this is only the treatment group, but it's all benchmarked against the control group. Okay? So we see that at baseline, so this is where they're at in terms of financial security, so quite low, right? Compared to the control group, they're the same. Then we introduce the graduation program. The different elements of the graduation program start kicking in. We start with employment support, boost people's financial security. Then we do the income transfer around here, boosts financial security again, and then the hurricane hits. And here we split between households that experienced damage to their dwelling and households that did not. So 2 years after the program, those who did not experience any negative effect of the hurricane, their financial security was sustained, so everything was fine. But for those who were damaged, we see that they experienced a deterioration in their financial security. Now, importantly, they're still better off than what they were before they started, right? So the program, and this is a good, kind of the upside of this program, is that it made them resilient to an important climate shock that they're increasingly exposed to. Okay, so this was positive news when it comes to financial security. People were resilient. But then what happened to social integration? And here the news are not so great, because we find a similar pattern of social integration going hand in hand with financial security, okay, throughout the introduction of the graduation program, the support bundle. But then when the hurricane hits and disaster hits, then we see again this big divide between those who were directly affected and those that were not directly affected. And importantly, we see that if you were damaged, even though you experienced only a moderate impact on financial security, essentially it wipes out all the positive effects on social cohesion. Okay? So it suggests that there's this overreaction to even a small threat to your financial security, that you overreact, and all the gains that we had seen on social cohesion, which were so promising and the UN was so excited about, because this is kind of an intractable problem that we've been facing for decades, all of those were wiped away, just because scarcity became top of mind again for these individuals. Now, one possibility is that, well, maybe this is just the reference points that changed. So maybe there's something about the sequence of events that because they experienced financial security, then the hurricane hits, and now it's very obvious to them that, oh, but we were doing so much better, and now there's this negative shock, and that's why they overreact, because they hate this loss, that they were doing much better, and now all of a sudden they're doing worse. But this is where the RCT comes in handy, because we can see what happened to the control group. So the control group never experienced any changes throughout, right? So they did not participate in the program, didn't experience any changes to financial security throughout. And yet we see that they have a fairly similar drop in social cohesion. So what this suggests is that even if we look at this from the viewpoint of a different setting without any positive shock to financial security having occurred, is that as climate shocks become more prevalent in many poor parts of the developing world, that naturally people will become more adversarial and more antagonistic because their situations, their financial security is changing. Importantly, what changed is not just being less willing to share resources. So perhaps this is just an income story. Now, it's very top of mind that resources can be finite, and so you don't want to share more resources. But it's not just that, it's everything changes. So trust in others, trust in your own. It just suggests that there's a shift in your mindset that makes scarcity very top of mind, and that is going to frame all your economic and social interactions with others. So, in summary, what story did I try to tell you tonight? Well, I think that zero-sum thinking can frame the way people think about important social and economic interactions. When we think about what drives variation in zero-sum thinking, I wanted to give you these two very different set of studies because I think they point us in fruitful directions for future research as well. As on the one hand, it seems like this variation can be shaped by the stock of people's experiences, so immigration, slavery, mobility, these are kind of more deep-rooted forces and circumstances. But as we saw in the case of the developing world, it also responds to sharp changes in economic circumstances. So, of course, these are very sharp changes, right? There's a massive inflow of a cash transfer, and then there's a big hurricane, but that these changes in circumstances can only matter. So, for broader policy implications, what I think this suggests is that economic policies can matter. So if you provide people with different experiences, such as boosting financial security, it may reduce zero-sum thinking. Safeguarding against bad experiences as well, so thinking in particular about climate adaptation and mitigation policies to prevent this scarcity becoming top of mind. But then importantly, and I think this connects to other talks that you're going to have in the sequence as well, I don't have much to say on political narratives, but this does open this hypothesis in this line of inquiry that political narratives may matter as well, because it's not just about your own experiences, but if you have a bunch of experiences at the same time, some more deep-rooted, ancestral, and others that your circumstances simply change very quickly today, that which one becomes top of mind and influences your views on policy might be driven by political narratives that just place some experiences more top of mind and more salient than others.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes to have a dialogue, all of us. If you want to come up and we sit in the table. So, Sandra, thanks very, very much. So I would like to have you come in and reflect and think about this out loud and ask questions. So let me just say a couple of things about what we just heard. One is a mark of good research is when it doesn't just confirm your prejudices and it just makes you to think. And in this case, I think there's a lot of things that we learned today that don't just neatly fit in a box. You want to think, are the good guys these guys, or are the bad guys these guys? And then you're like, okay, these are pro-immigration, but they're pro. So it's just not all just a neat picture. It's a very clear but new view on what's going on. So that I think is very, very, very useful. I hope it is for you. A second thought is that we've been thinking, Paul Stasemoglu and Robinson, and many of you are studying close to political science, and we've all been thinking about institutions as a determinant of the success of societies, and for a few years now, culture has been taking a bigger and bigger role, and this research is telling you that culture, or something even more individual than culture, individual group culture, but also smaller group cultures, really matter for development. And I think that part of what might be going on with capitalism, if you think of this age, evolution by age, is, hey, if we don't grow, if people have bad experiences, then they don't believe in the future, and they don't believe that the system is working. And so a question there that I think is up in your last slide is, to what extent can policy and things that we do kind of change this attitude. So just two thoughts on this to open up. Questions, comments, things that it makes you think about. Who wants to go first? Who has a, yes, go ahead. Ricardo, stand up, yeah.
I had a question about these two slides on the effects on the control and the treatment. The ones that were not damaged in the control, the social cohesion went a bit up, while in the treatment group it went a bit down. The ones that were not damaged, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe I'm thinking just being better and then worse, reduce the social cohesion, but being stable and then something bad happening makes you more solidary. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's an eagle eye as well, but you saw the trends. So they're not statistically different, though. So it's not that social cohesion goes up. So one hypothesis is that people pull together in times of adversity. And so actually the control group might have gone up slightly, but it's not statistically significantly different from before. So where we do see the drop is those who were damaged. So that's statistically significant, is that they do experience this decline.
More, yes, go ahead.
Do I have to?
Yes, I think so, because I think,
That's good. Hi.
thank you. Thanks so much.
As I understood it, the zero-sum thinkers are more pro-distribution, more gender equality, but more racist also because of anti-immigration attitudes. But it's still not clear to me or not obvious why are we trying to reduce zero-sum thinking, or why should we aim for that? I don't know. It's an open question.
No, that's a great question, precisely because of these offsetting effects. On the one hand, you get, let me maybe pick up on something that Luis said. So there was an article recently, completely unrelated to our study, I think it was Gordon Brown in The Guardian, who made this case about the problem with Europe is that it has been experiencing these decades of economic stagnation. And so people are very zero-sum. And in fact, he drew from some surveys done that 60% of young individuals in Germany were zero-sum thinkers. In the UK, it was also 58 or 59%. So incredibly high numbers of people who would openly view the world in zero-sum terms. And so his argument was that, and this is the problem, because then that's where populism steps in. People will start demanding excessive pro-redistribution policies and will be anti-immigrant as well. So this is kind of in line with our results. And that is going to compromise the enlarging of the pie again. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, you're thinking in the same line as he is, in the sense that maybe you don't want to reduce zero-sum when it comes to immigrants, but you do want to reduce it when it comes to pro-redistribution. So I think both are likely to be at play, and I think zero-sum thinking, in some instances for redistribution, you want to make sure that it's not that, as you say, we don't want to reduce it completely, right? Because we do need to have some redistribution for the more cohesive and inclusive systems that we're aiming for, but it's a matter of degree, right? And I think
Can I attempt also an answer? So I think I would give you two answers. One is you get into a bad vicious circle. So if we are if everything we are about is I want to take from you and you want to take from me, then what we're doing is we're increasing, we are not focused on growth, we're focused on taking from each other, and we grow less, so we have more stagnation, so we are more against each other. So we get all this group, in-group, out-group, all this tension. So you get less growth. I would think that's one consequence. But second, you get this tension. You get groups that feel like, oh, the reason I'm not getting a house because it's immigrants are getting housing. And instead of thinking, okay, if more people come, we can pay more pensions. We can also put less pressure on Social Security, so we can spend more on housing. And so people are more positive about the outlook, the outlook for the future. They are less likely to engage in this kind of pitting themselves against each other, blacks against whites, men against women, immigrants against those from the home country and vice versa. So I think that it's both an economic and a social cost. An economic cost, which is it gets you less growth, and a social one, which is it gets you much more tension. And you see that, I think, in a lot of as you said, Sandra, this populist bubbling up, where it's very much about the in-group and the out-group. It's like, who is like me? Like, in a way, creating a state is creating a community where people look at the entire community of people who are, and ideally at the entire world, as their peers. And if you think of tribal societies, the more zero-sum, the more it's just about your tribe and your family, and you only care about those closest to you and not everybody else. That would be my attempt at an answer.
This is actually at the heart of this course precisely because we don't look at that specifically. And again, it's a bit off the cuff now, but what you're suggesting is that the optimal level of zero-sum thinking is not necessarily zero. Because there are instances in which, indeed, the world is zero-sum. You do need some redistribution to get at the inclusive, cohesive model of capitalism that we're aiming for. And so I think that that's quite important, is that it's not that that optimal situation will be zero-sum thinking is absolutely zero. That's not necessarily the case, right? So that's an important takeaway.
Yes, question. What's the time? I don't see the watch.
It's actually, I think, like on the same line that you were discussing. I'm not an economist, so maybe I'm not doing the correct assumptions, but like the biggest argument against the net zero, I think it's growth, the zero mentality. But at sometimes growth isn't achievable, so you actually need to have a not zero effect. So have you thought like what's the optimal? And I think it depends on the country and the region. So for example, I think in Europe maybe it's that it's not as achievable the growth as it's desired to be for them to be a less zero mentality. I'm not sure if you have like further details of what should be the optimal depending on the growth circumstances or something like that.
So you're saying even if we had the best possible positive mentality, we wouldn't grow. So what's the point, right? In some sense.
Right.
So
that speaks to the determinants of growth, which goes a little bit beyond.
have you thought of this as the determinant of growth? It must be in your mind very much.
It is in our mind. It's not something that we've addressed yet, and obviously our design and our data does not lend itself to it. But what you're saying is this tension between what people want and what is possible and achievable. I think, again, going back to this argument that the problem with Europe is just that people keep demanding redistribution, excessive redistribution, that then compromises growth. Again, it's all about finding what is the optimal level of redistribution that will enable growth while still guaranteeing that that we have a just and fair allocation of resources in the economy. That will, again, with immigration, it's very similar, is that the optimal level of immigration is not necessarily 100%, right? So it's not open borders. Most economists will not agree with that. And it goes back to, the level of zero-sum thinking that enables a certain type of growth. That's a fantastic question for future research, but it's not something that we have looked at yet.
Yeah, I think if you think of the classic populist narrative, so you think of Trump, you think of Orban, and you think on the extreme left of people like Maduro or so you basically hear always like this. I mean, Trump is all zero-sum, right? It's like the foreigners are taking from you, the Mexicans send us their worst, the current account deficit is going to be, it's killing us, and if we just raise tariffs, you won't have to pay taxes, and Mexicans will pay the taxes, right? So it's all zero-sum, and it does in itself create no growth. To me, the optimal, I agree with Sandra. The European mentality has probably gone way too far in that direction, and there is probably growth to be had. And I don't think there are any constraints on growth that are exogenous, right? So this is a discussion we'll have often during this series of lectures. You don't have necessarily external constraints on growth. Think about how much more music you can consume, how much more films you can consume, and how much more entertainment you can consume without spending any resources. 30 years ago, if I wanted to have thousands of songs in my home, I would have to have all the LPs there, and that would be plastic and distribution and tracks, and now you have them all digital, right? So I don't think there's an external constraint, and I think if we adopt a more positive mentality, we probably can do better, but that has to be tried. Okay, so I think we finished there, unless there is somebody else. We have next week David Soskis, who is a political scientist and who's one of the political economists. He's one of the most influential persons in political science in the last decades for the following idea. The idea of varieties of capitalism, the idea that there is not just one capitalism, but there are many forms of capitalism. There is the Northern European one, there is the American one, there's the Asian varieties, now there is the state capitalism. And so we're going to learn about how to think of capitalism not just as one thing, but as many, and to try to think of the trade-offs that the different varieties bring about. So I think you will find it very, very insightful and useful, I hope. I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sandra.